Hi, welcome to Detours Understanding Acquired Brain Injury. And for this video, I'm going to talk to you about a can be somewhat controversial topic, but there's a lot of objective evidence supporting it, and it would explain some interesting things that we've noticed over research for a long time, and that's becoming clearer. So what this is about, it deals with, as you can see below, women and traumatic brain injury. And this ties in with a lot of other kinds of topics. So basically, there are gender differences, even though we like to pretend that biological sex does not impact health issues as much as we, like outside of reproduction and sexual medicine. It does have an impact on other areas. And a lot of this comes out of some research by two doctors from Stanford, two women who had a personal stake in things that they were seeing after conflict in Afghanistan after the war, and some other research that had been done. So what this has to do with, this is not about like gender identity or that kind of thing, although it may play a role in the long term depending on what we find for connectome research and things like that. But connectomes and that kind of thing, that's another video. So what this has to do with is how women recover from brain injury versus how men do, and those kind of issues. Deals with brain injury recovery. And there's kind of like, I've seen some things which are interesting, like the number of women in brain injury groups versus the number of men, and like the things they report, and concussions in sports and other topics along this line. So let's get started. These two doctors in Stanford, they both had daughters who had fought, who were in the infantry officers, and they had encountered an IED on the road. And there were 6 people in their armored vehicle. And, these two ladies plus these two young women, they're not the doctors, they're daughters and 4 men. And they all were seriously injured. They all suffered head injuries as well as other physical injuries. And they ended up going through Ramstein in Germany, the medical base, and then were sent to the United States. And what these docs noticed was that the men had recovered, almost all of them, no symptoms after a while. Well, we all know with concussion there are more subtle symptoms, and with brain injury in general. Their daughters did not. They remained in need of rehabilitation treatment. And they were curious why. And then they started to look through the stats and noticed that statistically, women did worse with concussions, sports injuries, things like that. So they began to then recruit women to look at brain changes from traumatic brain injury. And they found that women do worse. The Stanford studies. And they noticed things like more cortical thinning. Their women's cortexes after traumatic brain injury are thinner, and it doesn't seem to recover. Now, based on what we know, it's like there's a difference in the ratio of white matter to gray matter. Women have denser gray matter, or have denser white matter connections. Men have more gray matter. The nuclei are more densely packed, and so there's a greater ratio of gray to white. Women's brains have more white matter connections, so there's more connectivity. And we know that the network connecting is very important. And I spoke with a friend of mine about, like, because of maybe evolutionarily the hunter-gatherer differences, maybe it would certainly be a reasonable explanation as to why there are differences. However, when it comes to traumatic brain injury, this has an effect. So, if this argument about the hunter-gatherer kind of thing is right, then certainly, yes, it would, explain some things. But there are also other factors that plug in here. for example, women's necks, because their average body mass is less than that of a man. And understand a lot of this is with an asterisk. Their body mass is less than that of your average man. Not every guy, not every woman. And I'm going to have to say that again and again. On average, they're smaller bodies. They are shorter, smaller. So their necks tend to be thinner. So more energy. And so that means less, thinner ligaments. The muscles are thinner. So more energy is delivered to the brain in the same amount of force. So a car accident that delivers so much energy to the brain of a man versus the brain of a woman, I know, men not having brains, but the truth is, it's like more energy gets delivered to the brain of a woman from the same force accident. So if you're going 60, you have a crash, a man and a woman will receive different amounts of energy delivered to their brains. And if the ratio of white matter to gray matter is different, those gray matter connections, which are long and thin, are more likely to be torn. And that's something else. Women's neurons are thinner. They work the same, but because their body mass is smaller, their neurons have to be smaller and thinner. More likely to be torn, stretched, and broken. And you get the Wallerian degeneration. So more likely to be torn and destroyed, which also may explain the cortical thinning. So due to mechanical and physiological changes, they're more vulnerable. Also, their immune systems are more effective at responding because childbearing. So they're more likely to get an immune response. Because remember the secondary inflammatory factors. When you have a secondary brain injury, which is due to the inflammation and inflammatory triggers, that does extra damage beyond just the initial trauma. So women are more vulnerable to secondary inflammatory triggers. So their immune system revs up and will destroy anything that seems to be out of sorts, and it doesn't give the neurons enough time to heal and repair. So there's a third factor. Disruption to the blood-brain barrier. Again, those kind of changes. Also, then you have effects from just their social effects as well, and we'll get to that in a moment. And so you have to ask, it's like, one other thing, progesterone versus estrogen. There are experiments done to see whether progesterone or estrogen is protective. And they tried administering for people who had very severe traumatic brain injuries because rats showed a protective effect. But for some reason, because the differences in human neurons are different, that actually it's harmful. It doesn't help that giving progesterone is neurotoxic, not neuroprotective. So now they're going to try to administer testosterone. There are experiments to see if administering testosterone. No, I don't know what happened with the hospitals who did these experiments. I mean, it was like control group, experimental group, but it did more harm than good. I don't know. I mean, it's like, but it seems as though, at least in humans, progesterone is neurotoxic. Estrogen may be a little bit protective, but progesterone is harmful. So if she's not in cycle at the time, the progesterone levels, which are higher than the estrogen at the time or more to the balance, seem to be harmful. So maybe testosterone is protective. Don't know. So it's one of those kind of things. And then, of course, there are the social pressures. And that it seems like, at least in a lot of hospitals, women get discharged sooner. And many of their complaints are kind of dismissed when they come in. Oh, she's just being being female. She's complaining about physical symptoms and stuff. Yes, the research does support. And that they also had less time in the ICU. They were moved out quicker. It's unclear as to why or what this means, but their scores generally were lower. And here's something problematic. Women were 75% did not go back to full-time employment. 75% failed to return to full-time work who were working before, regardless of socioeconomic status. Only 25% of men traumatic brain injury from mild to severe did not manage to go back to full-time status. What this means is unclear. Now, obviously, it's possible, not taking into account those who did manual labor or more less demanding tasks. They did not parse it out, and that's certainly a possibility. But taking that large number of women who suffered traumatic brain injury out, that's a problem. That is a big problem. And since now a majority of women are the primary breadwinners, majority of women now are the ones in college, university, complete their studies, and they are now a majority of the population. This has got to be addressed. This is a very serious problem. And, I've had some images pop up for different things, but this is a serious issue. And finally, to bring up for secondary effects, the Perlman study out of the University of Pennsylvania. Women are significantly more likely to have dementia after traumatic brain injury. Caucasian women of middle class or higher status. Most likely, it somewhat relates to the fact that they're more likely to survive. But the study does suggest there is a correlation beyond that. They did control for a lot of those kind of factors too, for survival. So there's something else, and it's probably got to do with the destruction of the white matter as well as the secondary inflammatory factors too. Genetics, that's not well understood either. Connectome factors and genetics. Don't know about that. More research needs to be done. But the sports play a role also, and traumatic impact. Women are a majority of those who do not recover from concussions, who have, post-concussive syndromes, the symptoms from post-concussion. About 10 to 15% show permanent damage after concussions, and it's likely that number is much higher. It's just the neuropsych instruments are not as sensitive. We know about problems with imaging. So there are a lot of questions that we still have, but we also know from imaging and from the neuropsych studies that we've done that there's definitely a difference, and B, that women's brains are more vulnerable and that the damage is lasting and that there are long-term implications. And unfortunately, we are not spending the money in this country in health and research to do the research that is necessary to not only understand why and how, but long-term effects, how to get women back to work full-time, those who had full-time jobs, and to improve what they make. They're also more likely to end up in poverty or to end up underemployed, not making sufficient income, and to end up in trouble after they retire financially. So these are some sobering statistics that we've really got to deal with. And I'm hoping that someday maybe this makes it in front of somebody who has a congressperson or something like that to fund more studies, National Institutes of Health, NIH, whomever, state, whatever, because this is a critical issue. And because women with domestic violence, we know that's the number one cause of women's traumatic brain injuries. They're very vulnerable to being hit. And it isn't just concussions. It's even those subconcussive hits, whether it's sports or whether it's domestic violence or whether it's just a shakeup or whatever. Their brains are more vulnerable. So things that may not even hurt a guy can hurt a woman's brain. So please be aware and tell people that share this video. This is important to know. Thank you. And, it's like we'll be talking about this issue in other videos and interlinking it with other videos so that, this can be discussed. And, it's like the MRIs I'll have up, and we'll be discussing it with diffusion tensor imaging and connectomes and its implications with that as well. So have a good day. Please, any questions, comments, anything like that below, let me know. And thank you very much. Please like, subscribe. See you later.